What's going on, everyone? So today I have probably my most requested video of all time, and that is, what should I play instead of Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker? What are my budget replacements? And that's what we're going to be going over today. Some of the more played cards in the format, not all of them, but some of them today, and a few different ways that you can go for some cards, and in some cases, well, they are budget replacements, which means they're probably not going to do exactly what you need to do, because there's a reason why those cards are as expensive as they are. But these are some reasonable options for those of you that don't want to go out and spend, 45, 50, however many dollars per card that you are looking at. So that's what we'll be diving into today. Hopefully you all are going to enjoy. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, as some of you have even requested this video. And also, I have a TCG player link to pick up some of these cheap replacements if you want them. Let's get started. Starting us off with, by far, one of the hardest to replace cards in the entire game. Even Darth Vader has, I think, a more reasonable replacement than Luke Skywalker. But to be honest, there is one that does a reasonable job of kind of doing something that Luke does, and that is Chewbacca. There's a few differences. Chewbacca is one additional cost compared to Luke, so if you are trying to curve out into Luke or use U-wing reinforcements, that doesn't quite do the same thing. But Chewbacca oftentimes will defeat what you need to defeat and come down as this kind of end game finisher. There's a couple things that makes Luke as powerful as he is. It's the Restore 3, it's the -6/-6, and it's the fact that he's 7 costs. There are some other cards like Luminara that come down on 7 as a Vigilance Heroism unit that do some work in being like this decent body with grit and healing you up a little bit. Chewbacca goes the other direction where it doesn't heal and it's a little bit more expensive, but it does what you normally want with Luke, which is that defeating part of it. And to be honest, that tends to be the most important part to kind of get you to the point where you can start actually turning the corner and being the aggressor. Luke really helps you out in that by being this thing that your opponent has to deal with or just completely kill you on the next turn, while also removing some of their board pieces by coming down and giving something -6/-6. Of all the cards on this list, I would say Luke is by far the hardest to replace, and the one that you're going to be like, is Chewbacca really that decent? Well, Chewbacca is 60 cents and Luke is, $45 or something like that at the current moment. This is huge in terms of a price reduction. And of course, the effect will be a lot less, but you will still get a familiar feel when you are using Chewbacca coming down to kill something and being this finisher. And in some cases, when he comes down, you might actually even be able to get a little bit more value because he might be able to kill something, get even more powered up, and end the game even quicker, which does happen sometimes in some certain games. So while Luke generally is going to be a little bit stronger, there are a few matches where Chewbacca will come down and actually be a better finisher because of his grit mechanic. And in some cases, you can get a little bit more value out of that smuggle, which is pretty nice. And we're just hitting banger after banger here at the start of the video. I struck myself down because we got to talk about Darth Vader next. These two, in Darth Vader and Luke, are by far some of the stronger cards, and there's a reason why they are some of the most expensive, actually the two most expensive cards in the entire game. And that's because they're hard to replace. But unlike Luke, I actually find that Darth Vader does have some reasonable choices to replace it. And the first one we got to talk about is Maul. So Maul gives you the ambush and finisher / board game stabilizer slightly that Darth Vader does give you at 7. So both of them are command villainy. Both of them fit the same spot on the curve. They're both ambushers. And in some case, Maul can actually be a little bit more valuable because it can take things out like Anakin Leader, where Darth Vader can't. So there's actually some advantages that Darth Vader doesn't actually have. And in Maul's case, you even get that nice overwhelm. And in some cases, in an underworld deck, you can even keep him alive a lot longer. The thing about Darth Vader, though, is that you get this when played effect of deploying multiple things to the board, potentially getting a Sentinel down alongside Darth Vader or some more value, which is why Darth Vader is still played. But Maul does actually have some advantages over Darth Vader, and some decks choose Maul over Darth Vader because him being a better finisher with that overwhelm and higher power. Now, to get a little bit more janky, for those of you that want an even cheaper option that does something similar or even literally play a Vader, got to talk about Clone. So Darth Vader here, about $39, $40. Maul, somewhere around the $5 range, a very big drop. Clone is sitting at somewhere like $3, and you could probably get it even cheaper. Not the hyperspace versions, by the way. But Clone here, you can literally just copy an enemy Darth Vader, which is pretty sweet. So if you really want to literally have a Vader replacement by playing Vader from your opponent's side of the battlefield, look at that. There's a clone for you. Now, obviously, this only works in these matchups where there are Vaders on the opposing side of the battlefield, but clone does come in handy in some matchups where you can copy some more expensive things. This does have the downside of any matchup that's maybe a little bit less on the mana or resource cost. Clone's going to be a little bit weak, but you also get the upside of, well, copying some sort of unique unit and have it not be unique. Like if you're already playing Mauls in your deck and you play a couple clones and you have a Maul on the side of the battlefield, your opponent hasn't played their Vader yet, you can always copy a Maul a second time and or a Maul and get a second Maul, which you really can't do with any other card. So there are some advantages for clone. Realistically though, I would say Maul is the true budget replacement. And for those of you that are not looking to spend maybe like that $4 $5, you're gonna really be hard pressed to find some sort of ambusher replacement. Maybe that comes down to, you know, mercenaries and ambushing as a 6-cost unit. But really, Maul's gonna be your choice. Very significant price reduction and a decent budget replacement. Next up, another one that is pretty significant in terms of meta options. We've got Poe Dameron. This one has become more and more significant because it's popped up in more decks. You can even see Anakin Blue running it in some cases, Rey Red. It's not just a Sabine Green effect. And so previously I would have said, okay, if you're playing Sabine Green and you're looking for that finisher ECL alongside Wrecker, well, Steadfast Battalion is still a really solid budget replacement. But to be honest, that doesn't really fit what Poe Dameron is anymore. For Sabine, that still might be the case, but you also have two other options that can fit in kind of that style. Usually Poe Dameron comes down and deals damage to your opponent's base. In some cases gets to defeat an upgrade, which is really valuable. There's nothing that can really replace those. But in terms of being a good ECL target and being a solid body when you don't need to ECL it out, IG-11 and Anakin Skywalker both kind of fit that spot. IG-11 actually ends up being an extremely powerful ECL target because in some cases you can finish off two different units if there are damaged units on the opposing side of the battlefield, similar to what Poe Dameron can do. And that can be quite strong. You don't get the upside of being able to hit for 8 in the base, and you also get 1 less toughness. But I find IG can be really, really powerful for that reason, and it's still a reasonable 5 resource 6/5 that if your opponent ever has any damaged ground units, well, your IG can start picking them off, which can be pretty solid. Anakin, on the other hand, has the advantage of being a 6/6 like Poe Dameron, has this weird coordinate on attack draw a card, which doesn't really come into play. The hidden value of Anakin is the fact that he's a force unit. So Poe Dameron, as I mentioned, it's being played in things like Anakin Blue, it's being played in things like Rey Red, not just in Sabine Green. So if you are playing those decks, you may want to consider Anakin over IG, or even in some cases over Poe Dameron if you really want to double down on the force synergies, right? Because it comes with that force tag. So if you're playing things like Force Throw, if you're playing things like the Force is with me, or any sort of force synergy card, well, Anakin actually does have the upside that Poe Dameron does not, which is that it has the force tag. Now, there's a reason why people don't play Anakin over Poe Dameron for the most part, and that is because that doesn't come into play enough to be more valuable than Poe because of the just versatility of being able to defeat Jedi lightsabers and deal damage to a base. But in terms of Anakin, that does have that extra X factor, I guess you could say, to being a budget replacement for Poe Dameron, and that's exactly what it is, a budget replacement. And these truly are, you could argue that Maul isn't really a budget option as it's still a few dollars, but in terms of IG and Anakin, these ones are quite cheap. I think IG is just kind of that uncommon level card where it's sitting around like a couple dollars or a couple of tens of cents, but Anakin, a little bit more expensive since it is in the starter decks. And it is a special card, so it's going to be hovering somewhere around a couple of dollars, and in some cases even a little bit more. So that one could be a little bit more tricky. And we haven't really seen as much of Boba Fett lately, but this is another one that, well, a lot of people were like, how do I play this deck without Boba Fett's? This is one of the easier ones to replace, especially after Set 2 was released. So with Boba Fett, we got a 3/5. Decent stat line at 3, but because it's so cheap of a unit, there's actually a lot of units around that can do some good work. And to be honest, the best one that I've found has been Toro Calican. Now, they do a little bit of a different thing. Boba Fett was previously extremely valuable because if you did have that Boba Fett's armor, you could always drop it on a Boba Fett unit, and suddenly it's a 5/7 that's very difficult to kill, like extremely difficult to kill, and can completely take over the board. But without Boba Fett being your leader, you oftentimes aren't playing Boba Fett's armor, so that advantage for Boba Fett unit has really gone down the drain. Instead, we need to get value out of this on attack trigger. And there are some decks that can, but most decks really just play this and start attacking your opponent's base because your cunning villainy decks are trying to do so. And Toro has the massive upside of being able to attack multiple times in a round, 2 times in a round specifically, because you can only do it once. But when you play out Toro, you get to go ahead and attack, maybe play another bounty hunter, attack again, which is extremely powerful. Potentially use him as sort of a extremely readied up, hasted threat because you play him and then that same turn you play another bounty hunter and get to ready up Toro and hit for 3. This can kind of give you a little bit more reach, a little bit more ability to attack your opponent's base than you otherwise would have if you were playing Boba Fett. If you're playing a little bit more controlling style, I do find Boba Fett to be more valuable, but this is a situation where this actually isn't a budget replacement. I would actually prefer Toro over Boba Fett in a few of my cunning villainy decks just because of his ability to hit the base more often than a Boba Fett can. Next one is one that I've heard a lot of talk about, with the silencer being a huge part of a lot of the space decks out there. So a lot of the space decks are popping in and playing this 3/2 on turn 2. And to be honest, that's all it is. There's nothing with the action. There's nothing really with the tags or anything like that. And in fact, the Underworld tag with Mercenary Gunship ends up being a lot better. And so this is a really easy budget replacement for Kylo's silencer. Silencer is interesting because the silencer is better later on in the game, for sure, than Mercenary Gunship. The big downside of Mercenary Gunship is that later on in the game, your opponent can pay 4 and steal it from you, right? So you paid 2, your opponent paid 2 more than you, and they stole your Mercenary Gunship. It might even be able to affect your other space units with it. So that's the downside of Mercenary Gunship, is that it falls off really quickly as you get later on in the game, and in some cases, it's not really playable in the late game in that specific game. But in the first couple of turns, there's oftentimes situations where your opponent has to go ahead and trade, has to go ahead and kill, otherwise they're taking too much damage, this Mercenary Gunship, or just can't really afford to spend 4 to pay for this, because if they do, you can oftentimes just spend 4 to pay for it back, and you are heavily advantaged. And so early on, this is basically 1-for-1 a TIE silencer. And mind you, Mercenary Gunship is sitting like cheap cost, where you're sitting at 25-50 cents a copy, whereas silencer is sitting at like $26 or something crazy like that for a 3/2 in space. If you were playing Kylo Ren and you were discarding this, we would have a different conversation, but the vast majority of decks that are playing aggression and are playing space are using it as a 3/2. And so Mercenary Gunship is your go-to here. And the last card we got to talk about is one of the prominent options, especially in Sabine Green, the Darksaber. This one has been extremely popular basically ever since it came out, and it's sitting around that $19 range or so last time I checked. And the Darksaber here, well, +4, +3 for resources is pretty good, but oftentimes that's all it is. Yes, there's this additional text of, your Mandalorian units get to ignore its aspect penalty if you happen to have them. And on attack, you can give extra experience to your other Mandalorian units. Most decks that are playing this don't oftentimes have that be the case where you're ignoring aspect penalties or you're pumping a bunch of Mandalorians. The decks that are playing it, Sabine mainly, and don't really know if there's any other meta options that are playing the Darksaber, but you're not going to see more than one or two other Mandalorians in the deck. You might see like the Sabine unit, you might see like Sundari Peacekeeper, and you may go ahead and play the Darksaber on those units, but it's not like you're ignoring the aspect penalty because you're oftentimes playing things like Sabine Green. It's where you start to dive into things like Pre Vizsla or Bo-Katan, where you're trying to play Mandalorian decks where the Darksaber is harder to replace. But that said, we do have a pretty nice replacement in General's Blade, Jedi Lightsaber, and Fallen Lightsaber. I specifically mentioned General's Blade here because it is a +3/+3 for 3 resources as an upgrade on your unit. It also has this really interesting upside if you do have Jedi to go ahead and give you this resource cost reduction. Not as much power, but it's also one cheaper in terms of cost. And in terms of monetary cost, it is the cheapest of the upgrades that I mentioned as of, recording this video. It's about $2.50 versus the 19 of the Darksaber. So if you are looking to just pump up your units to a gigantic degree and get in a ton of damage, well, General's Blade is going to do that for you. And on a Sabine, right, Darksaber takes your Sabine from a 2/5 to a 6/8, but General's Blade brings it up to 5/8, which is still pretty solid and still good enough to go ahead and kill a lot of things that are coming down and still hit your opponent for a lot of damage. And in this case, you can even follow it up with things like Rebel Assault. You can even follow it up with R2-D2. You can just do a lot of different things with that extra resource. Or if you're playing on a 5 resource turn, you can play a 2 resource play afterwards. And if you are playing things like Hu Yang, yeah, you got the upside of playing General's Blade on a Hu Yang and maybe getting some value there. Not as strong, and there's a reason why people play Darksaber over General's Blade in Sabine, is because that extra power does matter in some games, but we're talking like, 1/10 of the cost with General's Blade. And so that's going to wrap up the 6 cards that are most mentioned for budget replacements. Luke, Vader, Poe Dameron, Boba Fett, Silencer, and the Darksaber. There's a lot of expensive cards in the game. Super Laser Blast, Vigilance, Cunning, Command, Aggression, Crate Dragon, Snoke. And some have replacements and some just don't even come close, right? I think the only one that's a little bit on edge is Luke Skywalker here. I think all of them outside of that do have some reasonable play, especially Silencer, Boba Fett, and the Darksaber. These other replacements or these budget replacements do actually have some advantages in some cases and actually are used over their counterparts. But, when we start diving into things like Super Laser Blast, there really isn't anything that does what Super Laser Blast does, which is pretty crazy considering. But these are the ones that are most often mentioned. If you want to see another video like this where I talk about more cards that are expensive that could use replacements, let me know in the comment section down below and let me know what those cards are. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.